Good morning, Paco. Paco, Juan Francisco, but we call him Paco, is the CEO of a development company in charge of development real estate. And Carlos Esquivel is joining. Carlos is the CEO of the solar EPC company and solar leasing company also.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Verne.
Paco.
It's a pleasure.
Well, that was the nickname of my very first student at that MIT program from Mexico.
Wow.
Yeah, he went on to do a tequila business, and he was the first one to get up in front of the whole class. And he was given, everybody, respected and loved him. And he got it when he was doing a lecture, and he said, look, the most important thing we've got to do is fuck us. Which is how they pronounce focus in Spanish. And we're like, what? We all have to fuck us? Well, okay.
Lost in translation.
Yeah, so anyway, that was my first experience of a Paco. And I assume it may be similar with you.
I'll remember Paco to focus. Don't you worry. It'll stick. Maria Dolores, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Verne Maria Dolores. She's our chairman. She's a very dear friend of our family and also an independent director. She helped us with all the protocols for the family business, and we're so thrilled that she's leading us at this point in time. Then my parents, Mario and Dina, that are joining. And my parents started.
Very nice to meet you all.
Nice to see you as well. So,
Good morning, Maria.
good morning. Is it appropriate? Look, about one of the only few kind of Spanish words I learned was guapa.
Guapa. Oh, yeah. That's a good word to use. Thank you.
There you go. So I hope it's,
Don't you agree, Dina?
Guapa. So
Dina and I agree.
Yes, absolutely. It's a good word to have. Good morning.
All right. Good morning.
Hi,
Buenos dias.
Buenos dias.
Good morning.
Yeah. The sad part was, so I lived in Barcelona for 8 years, and all I wanted to do was just practice a little bit of Spanish, just ordering my green tea. And so I go, té verde. And they're like, what? I'm like, té verde. And they're like, do you mean green tea, like in English? And I'm like, okay, I'm just going to say green tea. I can't do the V's. My name's Verne with the bird, the bus. I'm hopeless. All right. So guapa is going to have to do. And our little dog's named Guapo. So I know 2 words, actually.
Hector, let me just finish introducing you. My mom, Dina, my father, Mario.
Hi.
And then Hector Cruz, the CFO. I think Hector met you once when you came down to Guatemala, and you were in the offices that he was working in many, many years ago.
That was like 5 years ago.
Well, Hector, I'm famous in 3 places. The whole country of Australia, Western Michigan, for some strange reason, and Guatemala. In fact, the restaurant in Antigua with the chairs that have the plaques on them?
Yes. I
have a chair. They put me right next to Bill Clinton's chair down there. But it is, I've told people, no disrespect to anyone, other cities or countries here on this, but Antigua, Guatemala is like one of the most magical places I've ever been.
It is where I am right now, Verne.
It is?
Yes, I have my house here in Antigua.
Oh, I should recognize the beautiful architecture behind the wall, right? You go into this valley of volcanoes, and it's just lovely. So
just welcome to come anytime. Just let me know.
I will. Just make sure you have your what is it, class 3 armored car ready for me. So
it will be there picking you up at the airport. Don't worry.
Don't you worry. We have that under control.
Yeah, good. That was the only thing that was weird, but Well, I feel like I know all of you already, so it's a pleasure.
There's Nico.
Stefan, maybe you want to introduce Nico and
Yes, it's also a Verne. This is Nicolas Dorion. Nicolas is a very dear friend and also an independent director in the company. And also he's also implementing scaling up. And my brother Jonathan, who just joined.
Hey, Jonathan.
Very nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, and I'm a student of Julio.
Look, we're all students of Julio. So.
Also learning. Nice meeting you.
Nice to meet you as well, Mario, for sure. Well, we're straight up 9 o'clock, and if there's one thing about the Rockefeller habits, we like to start on time. So
Definitely.
should I
This is
share my screen,
sister
Julio?
Ariela's joining.
Yeah.
Sorry.
You can do it.
I'll do
Good
that.
morning.
I've got some slides that kind of go with the introduction here. This looks like Julio and I practiced this for years, but anyway. So Julio, over to you.
Yeah, of course. Okay, let's start. Good morning. Welcome to our Scaling Up conference. Thank you for attending this session. Our conference will take around 45 minutes, and then we will have 15 minutes for Q&A. Great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker, who I personally consider my mentor, Verne Harnish. Welcome, Verne. We are
So glad to be here.
Stefan, I don't know if you want to say something or
No, just thank you very much, Verne, for your time. Thank you for being here with us. We're all very excited, as we spoke before. We're all true fans of Scaling Up and what it has done for our companies and for all of our professional teams. We're thrilled to have you and looking forward to be working with Julio and Matt and you for many years to come.
Well, thank you. It's an honor for us as well. And Julio, do you want me just to kind of go through the background? Is that simpler?
Yes, please.
All right. So let me just give you a little bit of background for those of you who are not familiar. So founded a group called EO, Entrepreneurs Organization. Are any of you YPO members? Stefan, are you a YPO member? Yeah, I thought so.
My brother Paco, Nicolas, and myself. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So I'm actually
any other soon.
So we just brokered the first global formal event between EO and YPO, which I'll be moderating February 22nd. So looking forward to that, but I've had a long relationship with YPO. EO is about 16,000 members now worldwide. Today I have a company called Scaling Up, a couple hundred coaching partners like Julio around the globe. We're working on all 6 continents actively, and we're about 2,500 active clients at any one time. Wrote a couple of books, Mastering the Rockefeller Habits. Hopefully, maybe you have a chance to look at the Greatest Business Decisions. I'll reference a fun story out of that I think is applicable. I did with the editors at Fortune, and Jim Collins was kind enough to do the forward. This is the book, I think, why we're here. It's done well. And I've got a new book out called Scaling Up Compensation, just came out July 2nd. In fact, I'm doing my very first presentation on that tomorrow for YPO's Southern 7 chapter, which many of you know is one of the largest chapters in YPO. So looking forward to doing that tomorrow virtually. I'm on the board and vice chair of the Reardon Clinic. We're kind of the Mayo Clinic of alternative health. And Geoversity out of Panama. I co-founded and chair this. This is our Frank Gehry designed biomuseo down there, where we're really bringing executives to learn what nature can teach us to scale. This is actually going to be the topic of the February 22nd event we're doing with EO and YPO globally. And then I'm on the board of the $1 Million Women, where we're really focused on helping women get over that $1 million mark, and 1 million of them. So it's about $1 trillion impact that we're looking to have. And it's been going really well. We just hit our 5th anniversary with that organization. And then I'm an investor in a lot of companies. mid-market companies like Barcelona Housing Systems out of Barcelona, where I lived for 8 years. And I'm a card-carrying member of the International Brotherhood of Magicians, but I'm not going to do any of those illusions here. So let me just kind of get started. As you guys know, many companies start up 11,000 an hour, but too few scale up. So we're going to kind of talk about what it takes to keep you growing. And maybe a couple of quotes might be useful. And Julio, are the slides advancing?
Yes.
Because I had that issue yesterday. We don't know why. Something was going on with Zoom. But, you know, given what we've faced over the last kind of 18 months, I thought this Roman philosopher Seneca might have a couple of good words for us. And he said, look, whatever you do, don't stumble over something behind you. And I don't think wiser words could be spoken. And as you'll learn, most speakers teach that which they need to learn the most. And so this one probably is as applicable for me as anyone. It was a tough year with all in-person events being canceled, but we ended up having our best year ever in 2020 with a lot of hard work. Maybe a more modern philosopher, Andy Grove, rest his soul, at Intel, said, look, more companies die from indigestion than starvation. So with all the supply chain challenges, with the labor challenges I know we're facing in the United States and elsewhere, now that things may be roaring back, it could be more difficult than what we faced in the pandemic in many strange ways. And that's why these disciplines that we're going to be talking about are ever more important. You need them in the growth phases as much or more as you do when you're kind of dealing with pandemics. And then I think it's always useful. Hey, I don't know about you. I'm a big fan of soccer at FC Barcelona, though we lost Messi this year to Paris, but also American football. It, you know, kicked off with college, and the great Vince Lombardi at the very beginning of every season, even their most winningest season, he'd walk into the locker room and said, look, gentlemen, this is a football. And I think it emphasizes, again, how important it is to go back to a few fundamentals that John D. Rockefeller practiced 100 years ago to become, not that it matters, the wealthiest person on the planet at the time. And these same disciplines and habits are as applicable today. They were practiced by the late Steve Jobs at Apple and the 80,000 plus companies that we have coached over the 40 years are practicing. Yes.
I think the slides is not working.
Did they stop again?
Yes.
You jinxed.
We're in the Seneca one.
You're still the Seneca one. Julio and I just practiced this to make sure as we click through all the slides. I don't know if it's when a lot of people get on, but you guys see the Andy Grove slide?
Yeah. Yes, now we're seeing the Andy Grove.
Yeah, so, and you see this quote. So I think it really is critical as we possibly go into the roaring 20s, if history repeats itself, that we really have these disciplines in place. So did the Vince Lombardi slide show?
Yes.
Yeah, and so there he is. And it really emphasizes the fact that we've got to always continue to focus on the basics. And one of those basics that Jim Collins actually named was the importance of having a long-term goal, what he called the big, hairy, audacious goal. And what's interesting, one of our YPO clients out of Australia, Red Balloon, Naomi Simpson, they serve up experiences instead of stuff that you can gift. It's a really great business. She's #1 in the world in doing this. And you can imagine being in Australia with the lockdown that they've had, yet she was able to grow about 20% in 2020. Now, as things hopefully start to open back up, she set a very aggressive goal for this decade. At the end of 2020, she got her team together and said, all right, what is it we want to achieve in the next 10 years? And first, I love the way it's expressed, to serve. I think when we do serve, the world gives back to us, but she wants to serve an experience. Of course, you have to put in sustainably in there, given what's going on every second somewhere on Earth. Now, I want to put that in perspective. Hopefully do you see this chart, Julio?
Yes.
You know, she's been tracking this, and what we find important, it's what we call a Moneyball stat. Hopefully many of you are fans of that movie or have read the book. but if you're fans of baseball, you know that they measure everything. And they were, rewarding based on certain metrics, and they were recruiting based on certain metrics. And then Billy Beane came along and said, I wonder if there's any correlation between what we've been measuring and actually getting results, which are winning games and winning pennants. And sure enough, they found out that on-base percentage was what I'm going to call the Moneyball stat. And if you've seen those great scenes in the movie, if you've not seen the movie, I think it's always one I encourage teams to watch together, where Billy Beane is sitting there and they're going through certain candidates that they want to recruit. And they've got all kinds of issues, but Billy said, but they know how to get on base. And with a much lower budget than, of course, the New York Yankees, they got to the World Series, and the rest is history. So we encourage each one of your companies to determine what is that Moneyball stat, the one that we're going to really focus on. It, in a way, Jim Collins' profit per X, different way to look at the industry. And so for her, she said, hey, let's look at how many experiences we're serving up in amount of time. And at the end of 2020, they were up to 1 every 34 seconds. Now, I want to put this in perspective. If you're going to go from 1 in every 34 seconds to 1 every second in the next 10 years, you've got to grow 30x in the next 10 years. Our partner, John Ratliff, who now heads up our global coaching organization, he grew his company when he finally made the decision 30x in 7 years. And this is on already, she's got significant revenue already. And so for her to 30x is a big thing. Now, why is this important? And by the way, I love that she also, do you guys see the scoreboards, Julio?
Yes.
I love that, like in sport, the first thing she's did when she first came to our workshop in 2005 in Australia is she went back and put up scoreboards. Could you imagine watching the Olympics or any sport without scoreboards? We're just going to watch people run. We're just going to watch people bike. We're going to watch people swim. It's crazy to think about that, but that's kind of how we often run our companies. It feels like marathons where maybe I'll know at the end of the day, the end of the week, or maybe the end of the quarter, how we achieved. Her scoreboards, and it's not just this, it's all the numbers from Facebook likes to cash consumed are up big and on all their mobile devices. Like I can watch the US Open on my mobile device and know every ace and every air real time. She's got this up where it is updated real time, how often they're serving up an experience. Now, the reason we think it's important to set a 10x, at least a 10x goal, and that 10x could be revenue, it could be profitability, it could be reach, it could be the time you want to save. Alan Rudy was working 80-hour weeks. He got it back to 8, really to drive the business after using our tools. He's featured in the barriers chapter. Whatever that 10x is, the reason it's important is if you only plan to double, then, or 2x, whatever it is you're doing, then you only have to do a little bit better what you're already doing. But to 10x, you really have to look at it creatively. You have to look at it differently. And that's a really powerful mental exercise. And so it's one that we encourage you to drive on, and why the big, hairy, audacious goal is so important. By the way, it doesn't have to have a deadline. Everyone thought it had to have a, by 2030. A lot of folks do that. But it's really shooting for the stars, so at least you reach the moon, as the famous analogy goes. And so first, it's to have this kind of 10x mentality going into whatever it is that you think you want to achieve. And as I said, people always overestimate what they can achieve in a year and underestimate what they can achieve in 10 years. By the way, the other reason you want to go out 10 years, so nobody can debate you. At some level, you can kind of make up anything. We're going to put a man on the moon, and you've got some time to achieve it. But I know if you don't aim for it, you're probably not going to hit it. So it's a real thing to have this 10x thinking. By the way, we've got the same thing. And as Hubert Joly, who turned around Best Buy, I had a chance to do a fireside chat with him a couple of months ago. I don't know if any of you had a chance to dial into it, but his book, The Heart of Business, which I'll come back to, I think so far is the best business book written in 2021. Michael Dell's got his new one coming out October 5th, so I'm looking forward to that. And I think I'll be getting to do a fireside chat. But what Hubert said is, you don't have a strategy if you don't name it. And naming things is really important. So he gave a name to their turnaround strategy at Best Buy. And by the way, he 10x'd the stock. It was at $11, and 7 years later, he took it to $110. And so we're finding a lot of folks can 10x, not in 10 years, but in 7 years. And in his case, it was the stock price. For us, we've named it 20,000 scale-ups. So that means we're going to go from the couple thousand that we work with actively in any one day to 20,000, our way of 10xing. And what's always important, and this is what's often difficult with successful family-owned businesses, is you actually have a lot to lose. And that can be a lot of pressure. When you're an entrepreneur, when you start at zero, in many cases, the worst is you're just going to be back to where you started. But when you're starting with significant success already, the pressure of playing not to lose is intense. But if any of you are World Cup fans, they actually did some research around the World Cup, the last one. And have any of you noticed, like, your favorite sports team has got this lead, this maybe significant lead, and then what do? They change strategy. They start playing defense, prevent defense, instead of staying on the offense. You know what they found? 86% of the time, when a team does that, they end up losing the match, usually in the last 5 minutes of the extra, 10 minutes that are tacked on at the end of a football match of 90 minutes. And we've seen it in sport, and we've seen it in other parts of life. And so part of it is kind of a checkup from the neck up, which is really, are you playing to win? And I think setting that aggressive goal indicates to the organization that we're playing to win. As Novak Djokovic is right now wanting to win this, his fourth major. You can see the intensity in his eyes, and he wants that 21st. So he goes ahead of my favorite, Rafa Nadal, and then Roger Federer. So it's critical that everyone is geared to play to win. And I think there's great reason to be optimistic. In fact, I think we are for the Roaring 20s. The research is really clear. Two things. And we hosted Emily Balcetis, who did this research on one of our summits, that attainable goals really drive low energy. And in fact, if I might suggest an alternative term for chief executive officer, CEO, is chief energy officer. At some level, time is limited, but energy's not. And it first starts with your own energy that you bring. But if the total energy of everybody in your organization is higher than the competition, it is a significant advantage in the marketplace. So one thing she found is that attainable goals, and she actually measured it by measuring the energy levels in the human body, attainable goals were very low energy. By the way, ridiculous goals also are very demotivating. But what they called ambitious goals actually created the highest energy. And so you want to be ambitious without being, I think, zealous. And I know it's a balancing act that you've got to achieve. The same with, by the way, if you see a glass half full or half empty. People that see the glass half full end up having much greater success than those that see it half empty. Again, many, many research studies around that, obviously with college students. So sometimes you have to take this with a grain of salt. But I think the good news is, in the pandemic, we thought that the glass might drop by 20%. And to put it in perspective, we had an $88 trillion economy. Do you see the word 88 trillion, Julio? Is this continuing to advance?
Yes.
All right. If it were to drop by 20%, which is what Goldman Sachs and McKinsey were predicting was worst case in the pandemic, we would have seen it drop to 66 trillion in 2020. Now, but I want to put that in perspective. That's twice what the global economy was in the year 2000. So even if we had collapsed by 20%, we still would have been twice the size economy as we were just really 20 years ago. Now, the good news is 2020 came in at, it was down, but 84.5 trillion. So yes, we dropped 5 trillion. But look, my view is if you can't find the million or the billion to make out of that, it's really your fault. And I do think we're on for the roaring 20s if history repeats itself. That's why indigestion is really, I think, more of a concern than starvation. By the way, I don't think it matters what industry. I know we've got several represented by your group of companies in the family. You know, I love that we thought the car was going to put the horse out of business. Yet it is one of the most thriving global industries, over 300 billion. Now, what it did is they had to pivot from transportation to entertainment, and entertainment is one of the fastest growing industries in the world. In fact, I found this latest cartoon. I love it. Then the horse is pulling. Now the horse is being pulled. Well played, horse. Well played. And so, look, I don't think there are any bad industries. I think just bad strategies. And that's why the number one job Michael Porter said CEOs have is to set strategy and to make the slight or big pivots that are necessary. And the key question is, what does it take to win? And it really is the key to understanding the key topic we're here to talk about, which is how do we set the focus? How do we set the priority? How do we know what it is that we should do today? What is the number one? That's the thing that Ivy Lee taught John D. Rockefeller and Charlie Ives and everybody, Charles Schwab and everyone else is be clear, not the 5, not the 3. What's the one thing that you need to get accomplished today? What's the sprint, as they talk about in Silicon Valley, for the team this week or the next 2 weeks? And ultimately, what is that priority for the quarter and the year? The one thing that Tom Meredith taught Michael Dell, when Michael scaled and then lost the company almost at $1 billion in revenue, he was 26 at the time, is to go back and say, look, Michael, you need to figure out not the 5, not the 3, but the one thing you need to accomplish this year, break it down to 1 this quarter, and be clear what it is this week. And one of the things, by the way, we then share with CEOs at our boot camp is Michael Dell does it in an email every week. He updates the entire company, how they're doing on that priority and what's happened. Employees want to hear from their CEO. Greg Brenneman, who turned around Continental Airlines and a good friend of mine, his was a voicemail message out every week to all the employees as Continental went from worst to first and held that position for 9 years. The Google boys do it on what they call a thank God it's Friday phone call. Mark Zuckerberg does it at 5 o'clock on Thursdays. He'll do it here today with all his employees that can be dialed in so he can update them on how they're doing. But how do you know that priority? Well, it's the key to winning every war and every market. And that is what I consider the oldest profession. Some have said there's another oldest profession, but I think it was used to get this. And that is intel. Whoever has the best firsthand, not watching CNN or Fox News unless you're investing in stocks, and that's all driven by sentiment. But if you really want to know what's going on, you got to get boots on the ground. You've got to get intel right from the marketplace, the customers, the employees, and whoever has the best intel wins. By the way, it's why we've suggested I'm writing a new book on what top leaders ought to be spending their time doing. And I'm absolutely convinced over the 40 years of doing this, that the number one KPI is not the number of minutes, but the number of hours of talk time you're having with the right people inside your own company, inside the marketplace, and other influencers that are going to really influence your ability to move in your marketplace. How many hours are you getting every single day and week? And to the extent you can do it safely, nothing is better than FaceTime. We're in the middle right now of helping sell about a $70 million company. They run like $250 million. I think we're going to get a huge valuation. And I had dinner with them last night. And look, I don't think a Zoom meeting can replace the fun and the connection and all of that we had last night, the senior team and myself in the middle of this process. And so to the extent that you can, I'd rather you fly across the planet for the right lunch with the right person that can really move the needle, be it a critical acquisition, a relationship, fix a supply chain issue, than the other 100 things you might need to do. And that's where focus comes in. By the way, on that airplane, I don't know about you, I get more of that email done on airplanes and other work than almost any other place. And in fact, we had a chance to host Sarah Blakely at Spanx. You know, at the time she was the youngest self-made billionaire. And then Elizabeth Holmes came along and that whole thing's a mess. And we were interviewing her and we're like, you know, Sarah, how did you do it? And she goes, look, I think it was pretty easy. I didn't spend any time in the office. She said, I spent most of my time in the stores. Nobody knew I was CEO or founder. And customers would come up and say, hey, I really like this that you have, but do you have something that would do this? And she said, almost all the 1% changes every week. And if you can improve the business 1% every week, compound interest is your friend, all came from her direct contact with the marketplace. Sam Walton, you know, Walmart, you know, Sam would hop in his pickup truck and Sunday through Thursday, he'd go out and talk to customers, talk to employees, shop competitors. Later, he'd get in his airplane and do it. And that's what the senior leadership does at Walmart still today. They're out generally Monday through Thursday, talking to customers, talk to employees, shopping competitors. They then come back to Bentonville. That's why it's the bigger airport in Arkansas. And they get in a room and they're like, all right, what did we learn? And our view is you're either winning or learning. There's no losing. The same with Hubert Joly. The real key to him turning around Best Buy is the amount of time he said he spent in the store that was right next, close to headquarters up in Minneapolis. And it was his, you know, talking to the employees and hearing from the managers of the stores that really gave him the insights he continually needed in order to 10x the stock. And again, I would absolutely, this has got to be one of the best business books I've read in the last 20 years. Most I can read just one chapter and understand. I've highlighted almost every line in this book. It's such great practical practices and what it takes to lead a company. And you guys have got many, many retail operations. If we then look at execution, this need to be relentlessly repeatable. You know, we've got an HVAC client that we sold for $1 gazillion that actually ended up being that PE firm's best performing asset over the last 36 months. And it's in a HVAC, heating, ventilation, air conditioning company. But part of their magic is that they know that when their truck pulls up to a customer's home, they should always park it so when the customer comes to the door, they see the company logo over to the right. They have to kind of look up and to the right. Why? Because we know when you look up and to the right, it triggers trust in the brain. You don't park the truck so they see the logo to the left, you see it to the right. And everybody in the industry knows that. But this company makes sure that it gets done. Everybody knows that strangers ring the doorbell, friends knock. And so they always knock on the door. And if the customer doesn't come to the door, they don't go to the doorbell, they just knock louder. They also know that when the customer is coming to the door, you want to step back 2 steps. 1, you're still too close. 3, it looks strange. So they step back 2 steps. Now, again, I just keynoted the big organization, trade show for this industry. And everybody knows this. They all know that this company is the best performer literally in the United States. And it's because they can relentlessly repeat these simple things. By the way, I'm staying right now with Jerry South. Jerry scaled Town Park. You'll read about him on my book, to about 15,000 employees. It's not Facebook, it's not Google, they park cars. And one of the keys of their success is what they call the 31 daily basics. And every employee, and they're a 24/7, 365 company for the Marriotts and the Hyatts and restaurants that need cars parked. They outsource that to Jerry's company. If you're working, you're in some daily stand-up. And in that daily stand-up, you're going to review one of those daily basics. Like, do we know all the leadership's name at the hotel? And if somebody doesn't, then they take that day to review it. And so, I think scaling, growing up a company is kind of like raising children. I have 4. I think we've done a pretty good job, but if there's anything I learned, and I learned it from Tom Meredith, who was coaching Michael Dell, became his CFO and ran Dell Ventures, is, it really comes down to having a handful of rules, repeating yourself a lot, and hopefully, drive consistency. And so it is about relentless repeatability. So we've got a checklist. By the way, where's the safest place any of us could be on the planet? On a commercial aircraft. You're more at risk of hurting yourself walking across the street than being on a commercial airplane. They're at 9 sigma from a safety perspective. And part of it's, do you see the checklist, or did it stop again?
No, I'm seeing the book slide.
Are we that far back?
Yeah.
I am clicking a slide about every minute. So if it's not moving every minute. So there's our Rockefeller Habits checklist. Do you see it, Julio?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so the key to the safety on an aircraft is the checklist. No pilot's going to take off unless they've gone through it. And if there's drama, in other words, an accident, which is just terrible in that industry, they go back and study why, and then they update the checklist. Now, many of these are built into their systems, but you're piloting your company, so that's why this checklist is very important. So did this switch to Scott? Do you see it?
Yes.
Okay, so by the way, Scott, he and his partner were in our YPOer, were in our workshop in 2005 in Sydney. They had 50 employees at the time. Today, they've got 5,600. I just checked their market cap this morning's 95 billion. They've practiced these habits all throughout that significant growth. By the way, the two of them still own 70% of the company. They didn't give it away, as a lot of tech companies do. And as Scott said on the back of my book, scaling up a significant business requires really 2 things: discipline and focus. Do you see that, Julio? Did that switch?
Yes. Yes.
Which, as he said, I detail in my book. So I want to come back to this discipline and focus. And I want to tell you a couple of stories to drive this home. Many of you might be familiar with T. Boone Pickens. He passed away about 2 years ago at age 92. He was very healthy up to 90. Then he slipped and broke his hip, and it was kind of downhill that last 24 months. But he was very active up until then. And he had scaled to several hundred million, and then he lost it all, almost lost it all by the year 2000, at the turn of the century. He was down to his last 2.8 million. He had to sell off almost all of his ranch, the size of Rhode Island. And he's in his 70s, and he dared to ask the question, all right, you're either winning or learning. What haven't I learned yet? And so he went looking for the answer, and he found it. And all he did was change one daily routine. And he turned that 2.8 million into 4 billion over the next 72 months. Now, the reason I love the story is, first, he didn't achieve his first billion till he was in his 70s. And so I've got some time left. And number 2, I love the title of his book. The first billion is the hardest. Now, once you're there, the second, third, and fourth generally come easier. So what is it that he learned? He said, first, And do you see a picture of the human brain?
Yes.
That actually is Einstein's brain. They've actually done some research and they're like, all right, what is the mental capability that is most tied to success in anything, whether it's Messi in soccer or it's, Elon Musk in business. And it comes down to one capability, and that is pattern recognition. That's what we are, is pattern recognition machines. We're taking in data, and based on those patterns, by the way, that's why AI, machine learning, is helpful. They're helping humans look at that data and see these patterns. Then you know what decision to make. He then tied that to the fact that when you sit around and think about your problems, it just makes them worse. We're actually a being that cannot think our way out of anything. We actually have to talk our way out. It's the power of the YPO forum that many of you experience. It's a safe place where you can speak, talk out your deepest concerns and joys, and then have your forum mates speak back to you. Hearing, by the way, is like the most important sense from our paleo days, because we could hear the beast way before we could see him, smell him, or taste him. And we knew then to run at him or run away from him. So we got 200,000 years where we then developed speech 100,000 years ago, only Excel spreadsheets 35 years ago. So I can tell the health of a weekly meeting, it's lots of talk versus looking at Excel spreadsheets. And so tying these two together, here's what T. Boone did. At 5:45 a.m. every morning, not him, but two analysts would come in and start scouring the network and, the news to find out what has happened in the oil and gas industry in the last 24 hours. And if you don't think significant things are happening every day that can build up to impact, good or bad, the decisions you're making, then in some sense, our head's in the sand. And so they would gather this information for about 30 minutes. And then at 6:15, he would call in and he would talk to the analysts for 15 minutes, ask them questions. They would update him. He would push back. He'd say, go gather more information. And then at 6:30 to 7:30, he would work out his muscles. He actually he challenged President Obama when he was in office to a physical fitness challenge. And Obama, who's like 30 years his junior, turned him down because everyone knew how fit T. Boone was up until 90. And while he was working out his muscles, his mind was processing that intel, that firsthand intel that had just been shared with him, comparing it to what had happened yesterday, last week, and the last 70 years he had been in business. And then at 7:30 sharp, he would have breakfast every morning with his leadership team. No different than Steve Jobs had lunch every day with Jonathan Ive and the design team. No different than John D. Rockefeller had lunch every day with his 9 directors. And for 20 minutes, T. Boone and his team would get this talk time. Here's what I've learned. Here's what I think is going to happen today. Here's a move I think that we need to make. Here's an opportunity that we can go after. And then at 8 o'clock, they would go to work and, doing all the stuff that we all have to do, doing deals, making decisions. And then at the end of the day at 4:30, he'd gather them back and say, all right, what did we learn? It's very much like a military mission and the so important debrief afterwards, where we're like, all right, what did we learn today after battling out in the marketplace? What intel did we pick up? What techniques, what insights? And then we go at it again. I remember, so I finished high school in a little town of Kinsley, about 2,500 people. And one morning at about 5:30, my dad woke me up and he took me down to the local diner. And he said, I want you to see something, son. Over there in the corner are the Lewis boys. They were 3 brothers who were the kingpins of Edwards County. And he said, they sit in that same booth every morning and they have breakfast. And that's where they plot the domination of Edwards County. what farm we think's coming up for sale that we've got an opportunity, who's in trouble, who would we like to be sheriff, or mayor or something like that. But the pattern's the same. It really comes down to, and hopefully you see this, did it switch to gut feel, Julio?
Yes.
And we're learning more about this scientifically. We did some research up at MIT around CEO and executive decision-making. And it really came down to a 4-part process of making a much better decision. Step 1, make sure that you have the information. You don't need 100%, but you need 70%. It's not an 80-20 rule, it's 70-30. Do I really have a good sense of what's happening before I'm going to make this decision? So you got to gather the firsthand intel. Step 2, get quiet. Whatever your approach is to get to alpha state, to quiet the mind. We see it right now with Djokovic. He's been losing the first set. He then sits down and he goes into this meditative state like I've never seen. That McEnroe and all those guys have been commenting on it. And he comes out and he crushes the next 3 sets. But you've got to find that way to get meditative. Then step 3, step 1, gather information. Step 2, slow the brain down. Step 3, check in with your gut. Literally verbalize the decision as if it's already made, and verbalize as if you've decided the opposite. So verbalize it. And then that's step 3. And then step 4, check in with your gut. Does it feel right or not? And it's interesting. But what we're trying to do is train your gut. And that's what the Rockefeller habits are about. So let me go now to these 3 disciplines as a way to kind of summarize in a couple more stories. And then we'll have our 15 minutes for Q&A. If companies are not achieving what they know they can achieve, you may be achieving, but you can achieve more. It's one of 3 things. 1, where we've got too many priorities or we didn't pick the right priority. And the only way to know that is to have that data, both quantitative and qualitative, that feeds your gut. And then number 3, you've got to get in a room and talk about it. You need talk time, this day, week, month, quarter, year meeting rhythm that Julio is there reinforcing in the organizations. By the way, when Airbnb got in trouble, they lost $1 billion of bookings literally overnight. Nate, who we had, one of the co-founders on our summit, said, first thing we did was went into a daily huddle, 7 days a week. And by the way, they've continued it all the way through and post IPO. And so I had a chance to visit Steelcase 20 years, last year, celebrating the 20th anniversary of them implementing the Rockefeller habits. By the way, between the year 2000 and the year 2020, they were able to go from 12 million square feet producing 4 billion in revenue to 1 million square feet. They 12x'd their productivity over those 2 decades. And he said, look, all 3,000 employees, Bob Hendrickson is the one who runs all of manufacturing globally for Steelcase, good friend of mine. He said all 3,000 of our employees can see a board like this wherever they are. Notice it's not electronic, it's paper, but down the side, priorities for each one of these areas: safety, quality, delivery, cost, data in each of those 4 critical areas, and then the actions, the sprint that we're going to take here over the next week or 2. And notice, even though they have 4 areas of focus, they chose as a priority, the number 1 focus, quality. They actually put a theme together called Banish Sloppiness. If you don't name it, you don't have a strategy. So they called it Banish Sloppiness in 2020. And notice their communication protocol. Email was last resort. I don't know about you, but trying to solve problems via email is just a big waste of human time. Face-to-face if they can, and obviously they're back as a manufacturer. They all have bicycles, so they'd rather bicycle over to somebody and talk to them in the 1 million square foot factory than they would, send them an email. Number 2 and 3, video and voice. By the way, the result, they were able to take their defects per million, which they measure, from 4,000 and change to less than 2,000. They dropped it by more than 50%. And they did it by engaging all the employees. They submitted 909 improvement videos in the year 2020, already 457 so far this year. And I got to be there in their stand-up. Do you see a picture of the stand-up, Julio?
Yes.
It's 9 a.m. for 7 minutes, surrounded by their scoreboards like you would a coach of a professional sports team. In fact, we think running companies like professional sports teams is really the analogy, one of the best performing asset classes in the 21st century. By the way, Neil Malik does the same thing at his PE firm. He's the YPOer. They just raised another $4 billion in the pandemic. I'll be on with Neil again next week. All his CEOs, they've done over 100 acquisitions in the first 4 years. They've done 35 already this year. Go through our boot camp, go through this same 2.5-day workshop, have a coach. And they're doing the same thing at their company. Is that video playing, Julio?
Yes.
You know, they've got the daily huddles, they've got their weekly stand-up. You're going to see how their data is very transparent. There's their all-firm meeting once a week. There's Neil.
Dalia,
There's their KPIs up big. So I'll move on because we're short of time. And so this is kind of my final story, Sanjeev Mohanty. So, by the way, I got Sanjeev into YPO, and the Delhi chapter in India is one of the hardest 2 chapters to get in, Sydney being the other. And at the time, he was head of Benetton India. Now, first, it's a dying brand. Benetton has not been doing well, and it was really in bad shape in India, where Levi Strauss was the #1 fashion brand. And so he called us in to say, hey, could you help us? And the first thing I recognized is that Sanjeev had no intel. He and his team were making decisions. They were, I'm going to say it this way, they were making stuff up. They were setting priorities and deciding their focus for the day and the quarter based on what they thought as industry experts, but no intel. And so he made one change. And we put cards out at every one of the cash registers. He had 104 locations in India. And it was right by the cash registers, and it had his picture. And it said, hey, if you have an idea, complaint, concern, thought, email me. So they could email him directly. And by the way, it's as much for his employees as it was his customers. Now, he honestly thought he would get none. He thought this was a ridiculous idea, but we tried it. And very quickly, about 200 emails on average were coming in every day from customers and employees. So he did 3 things. First, he put a team together to look at all 200 and address their issues, just the same that Apple general, store manager does every morning at an Apple store using their Net Promoter Score. Number 2, he personally, as CEO, looked at the subject lines of all 200 of those emails. And that was like reading the headlines that Warren Buffett does every morning, 500 pages to get a good gut feel for the market and the moves he's going to make next with his investments. And so it gave him a good feel for what was happening at all of his 104 locations, both from the employee and customer perspective. And then third, he would choose one and he would email the person and say, could we have a conversation? My favorite story, it's a Saturday. He sees an email come in. It says, acid wash jeans falling apart. And it appears to be from one of the ministers of India. So he emails back and he goes, hey, CEO of Benetton, I saw your email. Could we have a phone call? Well, first, it just built a bridge with another influencer in his country. But number 2, he realized they had a manufacturing glitch. They had obviously had too much acid in that batch of acid wash jeans, and he pulled those from the shelves very quickly. Make a very long story short. In about 18 months, they went from worst to first, same as Continental Airlines with Greg Brenneman. And they ended up being the #1 fashion brand in India. Now, who did that upset? Who was upset by this? Well, Levi Strauss. So what did Levi Strauss do? Can you see that slide next? Did it switch, Julio?
Yeah.
To Levi's MD? He is now in charge of half the globe for Levi Strauss. And as you can see to the right, he won the Retail Icon Award of India.
It didn't switch.
No, it didn't switch.
We are seeing Benetton slide.
All right. So do you see that now? So that's the latest. So Levi ends up hiring him. He ends up winning the Retail Icon Award of India. Today, he's one of the most famous leaders in India from having led a lost brand. It came back to gathering the intel, and that's how we'll summarize here. Let me just summarize because we need to take some Q&A. And that is gathering the intel, using that to set priorities and focus, but importantly, talking about it as part of their meeting rhythm. So it's back to the 3 disciplines: priorities, data, and meeting rhythm. So with that, let me open up to Q&A. And I've got a couple of summary slides, and let me go back.
Perfect.
So I'm about 5 minutes late. I apologize. Those slides.
No worries. Thank you very, very much, Verne. Who's first? I know that Nico and Rob are all, maybe Rob can go first.
Yeah, well, thank you, Verne. I'm really excited to share this whole presentation with my team, number one, and that gets back to my question. I mean, just expand a little bit on becoming a learning organization. You know, I think most of our teams are very young, eager, willing to learn, and we're all trying to come up with unique ways of training and promoting their growth. Just a couple of comments on that, if you might.
Yeah, you know, one of my first students, Rob, was Henry McGovern. Henry's actually got the endorsement on the front of Scaling Up. So if you guys have a copy of Scaling Up, you'll see that endorsement at the top. He's a YPOer. And he had just opened up his first Pizza Hut in Poland. The Iron Curtain had come down. He went over there in his 20s. He then was in my MIT program. And he's remained a close friend, partner in a wine business in Barcelona, and growth guy. And he scaled that restaurant chain to 2,300 restaurants with 49,000 employees. And over a 12-year study, he ended up having the best, in their public company, best performing European-owned restaurant chain in the world, outperforming number 2, which was Domino's at the time. So not only did he scale, but he scaled to great performance. And so he invited me down to the 20th anniversary celebration that they held in southern Turkey. And he got on stage and he said, I've been thinking about what was the one thing, you know, the Moneyball stat. What was the one thing we did over these 2 decades that let us go from 1 restaurant to 2,300, on his way to being the largest restaurant chain in the world. And then he just sold it 24 months ago. And he said, it's because we were always a training company first and then a restaurant company. And we actually developed, Rob, almost all of our online education for Henry, because Henry would like, look, I got all of these people in Russia. We just opened up 80 restaurants. They don't know anything about customer service or management. And so he said, I'm not going to get any of these thought leaders to come to Russia or Poland, and particularly frequently. So put this education online. And I worked with a gal, Oksana, who was chief people officer. I love he didn't call it HR, chief people officer. And she's the one that drove the massive amount of ongoing training and development, their corporate university. Now, to underscore that, since you're going to show this to other folks, you know, Steve Jobs learned how to scale in his wilderness years when he was at Pixar. He saw the power of only having one priority, and that is they only had to do Toy Story. They only had one project for 2 years. And he's like, at Apple, we had like 12,000 projects. It was driving him crazy. So when he went back to Apple, and I tell the story in my second book, how he ended up going back to Apple, the inside story on that, the great business decision of that board to bring Steve back. He said, we're going to do the same thing as Pixar. And he got him out of all the other stuff they were doing, handheld, scanners, printers, said, we're just going to make a great computer. If I can't do that, I don't want to be in this business. Then he said, we're going to release a hit every 2 years. So his first was the iPod. 2 years later, the iPhone. 2 years later, the iPad. Now he's getting ready to die. And he knows it. Now, this is his baby. And he doesn't want this baby to die. He wants his baby not only survive, but thrive. So what was his final decision? What was his final project? And hardly anybody knows. It wasn't a product. It was Apple University. He hired the dean from Yale and he said, look, the only way this baby thrives is if I educate it continuously. And look what Apple's achieved. You know, the measure of a leader is how does the company run when you're not there? And Steve is not there. And this is the 10th anniversary of his passing here in a few weeks. And I bet against him. I never would have thought the company go from 300 billion to 2 trillion in market cap with the iconic founder dead. But he left the right legacy, which was one of a learning organization. One last thing, Rob, you got me fired up. Satya Nadella, when he took over as CEO of Microsoft, said, I made one change. I changed it from being a know-it-all culture to a learn-it-all culture. And they're the other $2 trillion market cap company. So I don't know. It's enough data points for me.
Amazing. Thank you.
You're
Awesome.
welcome. Nice setup question, by the way. I didn't give that to him. Rob and I have never met. We don't know each other. This is
I had a funny
magic.
feeling you were going to hit that out of the park.
Yeah, nothing up my sleeves here. So, all right, next.
Who's next? Jonathan, Ariela, Nico, David, Paco, Carlos.
Dina, what are you thinking? What are you thinking?
I am so highly impressed. It was really nice meeting you. And a lot of food for thought. I think that you're leaving us with a lot of not only information, but very simple and basic tools that can be used in any setting. I think one of the first things I would like to do is just think, you know, most of the time you don't spend that much thinking. And I think it's one of the greatest advices, you know, that I heard this morning, you know, like take the time, think and use your gut.
Yeah, that's great. Make sure you also, Dina, get the talk time. You know, I hope you've got that friend that you can just talk everything out with.
Yes.
And it's usually not your spouse.
Got it. Very clear.
Yeah, there you go. Good. Well, I appreciate that. I'm sorry. Paco, were you getting ready to ask a question, I think?
Yes. I really enjoyed the part where you mentioned to get feedback from you give feedback to your employees once a week.
Yeah.
I'm interested in knowing how does that feedback work in reverse with the examples that you gave, let's say Zuckerberg or the other ones that you mentioned.
Yeah, so Q&A with Mark at 5 o'clock Thursday, Pacific time. All the employees meet in an auditorium that are there, or they use FaceTime now because they're remote. And it's a two-way conversation. It's actually how Mark, as he was getting ready to go public, realized that everybody had switched from PCs to their mobile devices, and they had not switched to mobile as a company. And that became the next quarterly priority, not going public, which was one of the great stories that we reported on in Fortune magazine. And so it's a two-way communication. And the fact that, and then what Greg Brenneman did is he did something very simple. He said, look, every month that we're number 2 in on-time performance, they were last. Everyone, not everyone, the mechanics and the flight attendants get $50. So we're not talking about, you know, huge, relatively in the US wages. And if we get first, you get $65. And then when in 2 months, they hit number 2, that quick. They went from last to second in 2 months. Greg would then send out his voicemail message. He did a voicemail message every week that all the employees could dial into and hear his updates. But then he would walk around and he would pass out those checks to the flight attendants, to the mechanics. And that's when he would pick up the intel. Other ways it was, so I'll give you 2 other ways. Carrie Smith, do you guys know that company, Big Ass Fans?
Yes.
They're the ones that do the big ass fan. By the way, I love it. That was not the original name of the company. It was like VTC something technologies. But the customers kept saying, are you guys the ones with the big ass fans? So Kerry's like, let's just change the name of the company to Big Ass Fans. He then changed his title to Chief Big Ass. And look, I don't think an industrial manufacturer has gotten as much publicity as Big Ass Fans. By the way, Kerry exited the company to a PE firm for $500 million. And I had a chance to meet him 2 years ago, just before the pandemic. He and I were speaking at a conference together. And I said, all right, what was one of the real keys? And he said this: every generally Thursday evening, he would invite 5 employees and their significant other to dinner, to the nicest dinner you could find in Louisville, Kentucky. And by the way, he learned to say at the beginning of the dinner, last week's group spent $1,000. Let's see if we can spend more. Because the employees are like, uh-oh, this is a trick. The boss is going to see if I order just a cup of soup and that's all, right? But he said, no, let's celebrate. And that's when he built the relationships, the influencers inside. So if he needed to make a change, then they would help support that. And that's when he learned every week the truth about what was happening. Stonyfield Yogurt, Gary Hirschberg, who founded it, taught for me for years at MIT. Gary would take one employee to lunch every week. And for 44 minutes, it was like, how's the children? How's the family? What do you guys do? Niceties. 44th minute, he'd go, now, is there anything I need to know? And they go, no, everything's fine, Gary. And he'd go, are you sure? Because it may be another year before you and I ever talk, if ever. And they'd always go, well, Margaret's embezzling from the company and we found like a hair in vat 3 of the yogurt. And Gary's like, this is how he would gather the intel. Herb Keller did the same thing, hanging with the union bosses at Southwest Airlines. So emails, Benetton, dinner once a week if you're Kerry Smith, a lunch once a week if you're Gary Hirschberg, a gathering of employees once a week if you're Mark Zuckerberg. You pick what works for you, but it's that routine. For me, I send out a Where's Verne every Friday to all of my coaching partners. Julio, you get it as well. And then I hear back from them. And that's my invitation to hear from them. And then I have office hours where they can call in and share what's happening in the world. So that's how I get my intel.
Thank you. I think Jonathan had a question.
Yeah, thanks, Verne. It's been very interesting.
Yeah.
I had a question regarding focus. We talk about a focus and it's the basis of scaling up. However, we have like adjacent opportunities in many of our businesses, and even here we're representing very different industries. So one thing is to adapt the scaling process to any new venture, and that specific team is extremely focused. But however, all in all, like a group of businesses can be focused on many things. So I don't know if we are bypassing the system sometimes in creating many divisions that are hyper focused. But all in all, does that lead to people on the very top or anything to lack focus on having so many things to deal with?
Yeah. And so I benchmarked our work. I actually went out to GE. Now GE's got a bad name today, but in the heyday decades that Jack Welch was running it, I wanted to understand. I mean, you've got a company with jet engines, financial services, light bulbs, X-ray equipment in the medical field. How did they handle focus? How did they handle priorities? And what I learned, and we talked a little bit about this last week, Stephen, is first, they all shared the same core values. They shared the same purpose. We bring good things to life. They actually shared the same BHAG. Remember, Jack said, hey, our first big, hairy, audacious goal, we want to be number 1 or number 2 in all of our businesses. Now, to your point, Jonathan, what nuclear had to do to be number one with 3 Mile Island just happening is they had to shift from building nuclear plants to servicing plants. And they had to pivot dramatically in that industry. Some of them, they exited because they knew they would never be number one or number two. But so each individual company's focus for the next year was on what is it going to take for us to become number one or number two this decade in our marketplace. But even when it came down to setting a priority, I remember when I was there in the year 2000, Jack Welch said, our priority across all business units is to get digital. And so the overarching was one that could be applicable and importantly applicable to all the business units that they had. Now, when I was there at Dell and Michael came back, I remember the year they set the priority to get into the server business because they needed to take Compaq down. Compaq was subsidizing their laptops off the huge margins they had with servers, and Michael wasn't in the server business. So his priority for the year was to go from nothing to number 3 provider of servers in the world. Now, at the same time, they're making laptops and desktops and all kinds of other things. So you still have to run those businesses, those business units. But the thing he reported on every day, the thing he talked about every week, and what they achieved in that year was they got in the server business and they crushed Compaq. The next year, Compaq was sold to HP. So you've got to be clear at the top, the one thing you've got to get accomplished this week, this quarter, this year. And here's the dirty little secret. The knee bone connects to the thigh bone. If you've got 50,000 employees, each doing one thing important, you can get 50,000 things done. And that's the magic of the process. So that's the mental game, Jonathan, that you play. I hope that in this short amount of time we've got somewhat makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, all right. Can I take a moment just to finish up this last few slides? I know we're over time. So it's interesting. We've for years have talked about SMART goals. I never liked the acronym, though I put it in my first book. I put it in Scaling Up. And some MIT professors came along and said, maybe the acronym FAST is better than SMART. And I like it because it connotes growth. And it says, really, goals have to have 4 things. 1, they need to be frequently discussed. That's why the meeting rhythm, what's your priority today in the daily huddle? How are we on our priority for the week? Michael or Mark Zuckerberg, whatever, reporting out then at the end of the week, or Greg Brenneman, our on-time performance. Let's frequently discuss the goal, not just write it down and put it on the shelf. Number 2, as I already suggested, they need to be ambitious. Number 3, obviously specific and measurable. And then last, transparent. And I know this can be very sensitive culturally. And so I was in Egypt last February, just before the pandemic, with the YPO chapter in Egypt. And they pulled me aside and they go, look, Verne, we're not really into this transparency thing in Egypt, where everybody knows everyone's numbers. I'm not talking about wages and salaries, but everyone knows everyone's KPIs. It's visible, as you saw at K1 when it's up on the wall big for everyone to see. And what's interesting is the night before, Egypt's soccer team had just won a significant match that put them in some regional contest. And I said, do all the Egyptian people know the stats of all the Egyptian players, like real time? They go, yeah. And I said, and isn't Egypt sending a team to the Olympics? And at the time we thought it was going to be in 2020 in Japan. And they go, yeah. And I said, is every Egyptian citizen going to be painfully aware of how well their Egyptian athletes are performing real time? And is that athlete going to have to be willing in front of everybody to perform and let everyone know their score? And he goes, yes. And I said, well, don't tell me it's cultural then. Any country that plays sports, any country that participated in the Olympics is in a situation where their players are facing this kind of transparency, and you wouldn't have it any other way. And so if you want to run a professional organization like your professional teams, you need this transparency of information. And that changed it. That changed the conversation with the leaders there in Egypt. To wrap up then, hey, my favorite book of all time, throw Scaling Up off the boat if you can only read one book. And it's Eli Goldrath. He passed away the same year Steve Jobs did, called The Goal. How many of you have read The Goal? Just here. Okay, good. It's a great parable. So I just want to remind you, he taught us two things. Don't smoke. And number two, what he called, did that switch theory of constraints, Julio?
Yes.
It's not about weakness. It's about understanding the constraints. So my final story out of my second book, did soft soap pop up there? So Robert Taylor takes liquid soap, soft soap, in 1980 from 0 to 39 million. Now it's a huge success product. Now he's getting ready to take it to 100 million in year 2. What are his constraints? It's like you said, Jonathan, and some said, he's got 100 of them. Supply chain, distribution, employees, ramping up systems. I mean, this is a problem of indigestion. And he could have solved all of them. But he had one of his earlier products ripped off by Colgate-Palmolive. And he was hearing, his intel was telling him, his friends were telling him that Colgate-Palmolive was getting ready to jump into the market and steal his idea again. So he goes, all right, that's got to be my focus. If I don't stop Colgate, none of the other matters. And so he stepped back and Dina, as you said, took some time to really reflect. He said, there's the constraint, the spring pump. There's only one company at the time. China was not even on board manufacturing anything. This is 1980. Company out of California called Caltech that made those spring pumps. So he said, that's my most important face-to-face. He flies out. He said, how many units did you sell? What was your biggest customer last year? He said, 5 million spring pumps. He goes, how many spring pumps do you guys make? And they go, we make about 100 million spring pumps a year. And he goes, sold. He negotiated a 12-cent price. It was a $12 million purchase order on a company with 39 million in revenue. But he figured he could pay it out $1 million a month over the second year as he goes to 100 million, but he would control his destiny. Now, Colgate-Palmolive, Procter & Gamble decide liquid soap is a hit, but there's no spring pumps. They can't get into business. And ultimately, Colgate-Palmolive was forced to buy him in order to get the spring pumps. And it was $1 gazillion. It was actually 75 million, which was a lot of money back in 1980. But we call this strategy simply blackmail. You want to be in the blackmail business. You want to control your destiny. So did this switch to Steve Jobs? So this wasn't lost on Steve. Remember, Steve had his operating system ripped off by Bill Gates, his friend Bill Gates, this famous screaming match on the movie. And so now he's getting ready to save his company. And he comes out with the iPod. By the way, job to be done, 1,000 songs in your pocket. So first thing he does, he's broke. He goes to Bill Gates, said, Bill, I need you to give me 150 million. Bill said, how quick can I send the money? Now, why did Bill do that? Because Steve understood Bill's constraint. The most important thing you can understand is what is the constraint in between your own ears? What is the constraint in your business? What is the constraint in the industry? And what is the constraint of your competitors? Understanding that landscape is critical. And so Bill Gates' problem was all the pressure around antitrust. And so Steve said, Bill, if I fail, it's going to cost you billions in antitrust problems. Bill's like, you're right. I'm going to send 150 million. Then what did he do with that money? There was only one proprietary Toshiba flash drive big enough to hold 1,000 songs in your pocket. It would fit in that smaller device. And in the biggest decision ever made, kind of FU/FU decision, where Steve battled it out with one of his engineers. They finally decided to place one of the biggest purchase orders to lock up the worldwide rights to this proprietary Toshiba flash drive. So when he launched the iPod, Sony, Microsoft, nobody could compete with him, and it gave him the runway. And that's what Elon Musk has understood. He's in cars, he's in solar, but he knows the constraints, the battery. And if he can control the battery, be the intel inside every car, every home, every commercial building, every country, the big battery packs he's got helping manage demand in Australia, then he can control his destiny. And this is the big advantage he has over all the other companies that are jumping into the electric car business, is he's way up the learning curve with the battery technology. And that is the constraint. So that's what you're really trying to do, is line up the 1,000 things that you are facing, like Taylor was in launching soft soap, and you've got to find the front domino. And if you can control it and knock it over, then you've got tremendous leverage. It ultimately comes back to, and hopefully you see, do you see Curly with his finger? Yeah. It comes back to that. Today, this week, this quarter, this year, in the next 10 years. But it requires intel of the firsthand kind and some quiet reading and thinking time, as Charlie Munger said Warren Buffett does every day, why he's the greatest investor of all time. And Dina, you emphasized in your comments. So with that, we're about 15 minutes late. I apologize, but hopefully it's helpful.
Thank you very much for your time, Verne. We're very thankful that you gave us all of the tips, and we hope to see you very soon.
You got it. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you very much.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful meeting you.
Everybody.
Bye, Office.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
All the best.
Right.
Thank you.